I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With us, a real treat. He's a semi-regular guest, comes out for us and talks and gives up his time. He is a best-selling author, of course, This Monster, Currency Wars, kind of giving it away, expert on gold, another best-selling book, The Death of Money, another big book, The Road to Ruin. He's just done the Hat Trick +1, and I think he's going to be the Hat +2. He's here to talk about this aftermath. And I want to bring him on, James G. Rickards. James Rickards, thanks for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
Thank you, Greg. Great to be with you again.
You know, I talked to you in the pre-interview about this. We're just going to riff. This is going to be kind of like my Weekend News wrap-up and the early Sunday release all at one. Your book is coming out next Tuesday, the 23rd of July. You can get this pre-order at Amazon. We'll put up all the links at the end of this. But a lot of people think that 2008 and 9 are behind us. Everything's okay. Of course, I've read your books. I know you think it's not okay. And you wouldn't write a book called Aftermath that, again, is coming out on Tuesday, July 23rd. You wouldn't write a book called Aftermath. Is everything okay? What are they not getting? What's coming that they don't realize is coming? Obviously, you're writing a book called Aftermath. What's coming for people?
Well, it's a great question, Greg. And the word aftermath, or the title aftermath, has two meanings. One is the one you referred to, which is we are still in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. Now, I understand that the economy has been expanding for 10 years and we're not in a liquidity crisis at the moment and unemployment's low. So yeah, we've come a long way from that. But the fundamental problems that gave rise to that panic have not been solved. All that's happened is, you go all the way back to 1998, you had an emerging markets debt crisis and you had the famous long-term capital management Russia crisis, and Wall Street came in and bailed out a hedge fund. They didn't want to, but they were really bailing out themselves because they would have been the biggest losers. Lehman Brothers would have failed 10 years before it actually did. It would have been the next domino to fall in 1998. So Wall Street lifted, in effect, the balance sheet of a hedge fund. In 2008, it was Wall Street that was in distress. Bear Stearns, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, Lehman Brothers, AIG, et cetera, and within days, Morgan Stanley, Goldman Sachs, and Citi would have failed, and the Fed came in and lifted that balance sheet, those balance sheets from Wall Street, and they did it by guaranteeing every money market fund in America, guaranteeing every bank deposit in America, regardless of deposit insurance. Deposit insurance covers $250,000, but the Fed said no limit. You have $1 million, $10 million, whatever. We guarantee it. They did trillions of dollars of currency swaps with the European Central Bank. So the European banks were in just as much distress. They turned to their central bank, the ECB, and said, give us dollars. The ECB doesn't print dollars, they print euros. So what had to happen is the Fed printed up a bunch of dollars, the ECB printed up a bunch of euros, and they did what's called a currency swap. So, and this was not known at the time, this came out years later, but the Fed ended up with trillions of euros, but the ECB got trillions of dollars, which they could then use to bail out their own banking system. So, unlimited guarantees, unlimited money printing, unlimited currency swaps. Yeah, and they truncated the crisis, but all that happened was the bad debts and the problems and the leverage were now lifted up to the central bank level. So you have this progression. First it's a hedge fund, then it's Wall Street, now it's the central banks. Who's going to bail out the central banks? And that's really the question. So that problem hasn't been solved. It's still on the table. The Fed has not normalized its balance sheet. They'd like to, but they haven't done it. They have not normalized interest rates. They need to get interest rates up to around 4% to get ready for the next recession. They need to get the balance sheet down to about $2.5 billion in case they have to go to QE4. They have not accomplished either one of those tasks in 10 years. So the problem is still there.
You said $2.5 billion, $2.5 trillion.
Sorry, my mistake, 2.5
Okay.
trillion. That might be a number that would give them some headroom to go back up to 4.5 trillion if they had to do QE4. But they haven't accomplished either one of those. Interest rates, okay, they're 2.25%, but that's not what you need to get out of a recession. If the U.S. economy went into a recession today, I'm not saying it is, but if it did, history and economics show that you need to cut interest rates 4 to 5% to get the U.S. out of a recession. Now, how do you cut interest rates even 4% if you're at 2.5% or 2.25%? You can't. You don't have enough room. You get to zero pretty quickly. Now what do? You're still in a recession. Well, you go back to QE4. Well, how do you do that if your balance sheet is still around $4 trillion? you're at a boundary. You're at a confidence limit. So they're not ready for the next recession. They can't get there, and that's even more concerning. Concerning. It'd be one thing if you said, "All right, we'll give the Fed another year. They'll raise four more times. They'll get to 3.25%. They'll keep QT, quantitative tightening, get the balance sheet down to 2.5, maybe 3 trillion." It would be one thing if they could do that, but what they've shown is they can't. The economy gets dangerously close to recession. The stock market falls off a cliff, has a hissy fit, if you want to put it that way, every time they try to go in the direction they would like to go. So what they've had to do is back off. They've now done a 180. They're going to cut interest rates on July 23rd. That's as close to a sure thing as you can get. They're going to stop the QT. I still run into people, Greg, who complain about, oh, the Fed's printing money, quantitative easing. They're not. They're burning money. They're reducing the money supply, the M0, the base money supply. They're reducing it. It's the equivalent of, you had this picture of Bernanke throwing money out of a helicopter. That was QE. Picture Jay Powell with shovels shoveling money into a furnace. That's QT. They're reducing the money supply. But that's going to end September at the latest. They might surprise us this month by ending it early. We'll see. But they can't raise rates. They can't reduce the balance sheet. They're having to cut rates, stop QT. Well, that'll give the stock market a boost. It already has. May keep the economy going. That's fine. But they can't get to where they need to be. They're not ready for the next recession. So all these problems have been deferred. They've been papered over, but they have not been solved. That's the point. The second meaning of aftermath is when this new crisis hits, and it will hit, and we can talk about that, there's going to be an aftermath of that crisis, and that will be very different. The next crisis will be worse than the last one, and the aftermath will be very different. It'll be a very different world. It's not the end of the world. I'm not talking about Mad Max or The Road by Cormac McCarthy or a nuclear hot. I'm not talking about that. I'm just talking about a radically different system, simpler, where a lot of systems fail and have to be rebuilt. So the aftermath of the 2008 crisis is not over. The aftermath of the next crisis is coming, but you don't have to be helpless. We're not helpless. There are things you can do today to prepare, and I talk about that in the book.
I wanted to kind of get into some stuff that I would have covered in my weekly news wrap-up. Just your words on Epstein. I brought this up to Martin Armstrong, and he said, well, it's a reflection of people's losing confidence in government. What do you think about the whole Epstein affair with the possible extortion racket, the pedophilia, the Lolita Express reported in the news, the orgy island, the whole deal with all kinds of dignitaries and people that could possibly be involved? What's your reflection of that and what's coming with the aftermath with what you're talking about?
Well, I would say based on what we know or what is likely, again, based on the testimony of what appear to be credible witnesses, it's pretty sordid, pretty disgusting. I happen to be a lawyer. I'm an economist and a lot of experience in investment management, but I'm also a lawyer, so I know to give people the benefit of the doubt. I don't prejudge cases, but this is a guy who was already convicted. So regardless of how the next case turns out, he's already convicted of various sexual crimes. Again, you can be pretty critical of the plea deal that he got in Florida. I believe it was in 2008, if I'm not mistaken. So we already know he's a sex offender. That's not news. Let's see how this plays out. I don't want to jump to conclusions. Who was on the island, who wasn't, who did something and who didn't. Let's see what the facts reveal. But at a high level, I would say this is a very, very sad commentary on society. It's not just his personal decadence, which seems obvious, but I would expand that to say the decadence of the people who are hanging out with him, flying on the plane, having dinner. I mean, you know kind of who this guy is. Why are you spending time with him? So it is a broader indictment of society beyond just his personal situation.
What do you think about what's going on in politics? I mean, what the president is talking about is we could end up with communism, socialism. He's tweeting out we're not going to be a communist or socialist country, and he's taking it to Nancy Pelosi and the so-called squad. What do you think about that?
Well, Greg, again, I try not to get too emotional. I'm an analyst, but I will say, go back to 2016. I went around the world in late 2016. I was actually on book tour for my previous book, The Road to Ruin. And I was in Australia, Europe, New York, the places you might expect. And I was doing a lot of TV interviews right at the end of October, very beginning of November, up to the night before the election. And they'd ask you who's going to win. I say, well, Donald Trump's going to win. And I said, it'll be close. We'll be up late, but Trump's going to win. And by the way, I never say things like that without a lot of analysis behind it, a lot of data behind it. It wasn't a personal preference. And I said Obama was going to win in 2012. I didn't vote for Obama. That's a personal choice. Everyone vote who they want for whom they want. But all the hedge fund guys on Wall Street were Romney's going to win. I said no, he's not. And then 2016, it was Hillary, and I said that Trump was going to win. But that was not. But I got laughed at. I got ridiculed. One host, her face turned white. What do you mean? Are the polls wrong? Or the turnout going to be different? I said both. I said the polls are wrong. Here's why, and turnout's going to be higher. Here's why. So you have to take an analytical approach. By the way, in June 20th, 2016, I was in what they call a capsule in the London Eye. That's the big Ferris wheel on the south bank of the Thames with a camera crew. And I said the UK is going to vote to leave the EU. They're going to vote for Brexit, and you should short sterling and go long gold. And that's what happened. So for months afterwards, I was getting letters and emails and such. Thank you for putting my kids through college because I took your advice and that worked out very well. But my point is, I have an analytical method. I have very good predictive analytics. I don't use polls or data points, but I don't rely on polls. I don't use the models that most people in Washington and Wall Street use. I use Bayesian statistics. I use complexity theory, history, behavioral psychology. I use a lot of other things. So with that track record, so I said the EU is going to leave. The UK is going to leave the EU. The world was shocked. That's what happened. I said Trump was going to win. The world was shocked. That's what happened. So where are we now? Right now, I've got Trump at about a 65, maybe slightly higher, 65% probability of winning. So
Wow.
We'll see what happens. We're still a year away.
Is that because of all this I mean, a lot of people are turned off by the whole socialism, social justice, do away with ICE, do away with Second Amendment. Hillary Clinton said there are limits to the Second Amendment and limits to the First. There's a lot of people that are very worried about, especially people in the middle, the far left isn't, but the people in the middle are like, whoa, what? Everybody raised their hands for health care for illegal aliens.
Yeah, those are all factors, and we'll be hearing more about them. But again, I have my opinions like everyone else. It's premature, so we all have a view. But I try not to let my opinions and core beliefs get in the way of good analysis because I am an analyst. I don't, it doesn't help me to be wrong about these things. So I work really hard to be right. So the biggest factor in my model is the economy. Sorry, I know the Squad and Pelosi and healthcare. But I got it. I understand it all.
Got it.
It doesn't matter that much. We will be hearing more about it. It's the economy, but you can go back to Woodrow Wilson or even before, and no incumbent president, no first-term president has ever lost re-election unless there was a recession. There were only two, Jimmy Carter in 1980 and George H.W. Bush in 1992. They were incumbents who lost, but we were in bad recessions both times. So if you put a recession in the mix, Trump's chances go way down. But if there's not a recession, the odds of him losing are, candidly, they're kind of close to zero. But I've got it. So what you have to do is say, well, okay, what's the probability of recession between now and next summer? Give that a number. And then the inverse is Trump's probability of winning. So if you put recession odds to say 35%, and that's probably high, but, make that your estimate, then the inverse, 65% is his probability of winning. But there's what's called theta or time decay in that. Every month that goes by, the odds of a recession by next summer go down just because there's less time. So the odds of Trump winning go up. So under my model, I would expect that next month I'll tell you 67%, and by December I'll tell you 71%. I'm going to keep raising Trump's percentage every month that goes by because the odds of a recession go down. And by the way, the Fed is helping. I don't think Jay Powell wakes up in the morning and says, "What does Trump want me to do?" I think he is running an independent monetary policy with, I critique their models. I critique the advice they get, but I don't critique their good faith. I think Powell's doing the best he can, but Powell understands. He got a shock, kind of a kick in the head last December when we came very close to recession,
Yeah.
and he said, first, we're putting rates on pause. He used the word patient. That's one of those Fed code words. It means we're not going to raise rates until we tell you. We'll give you a heads up. But now they've gone beyond that. They've taken outpatient, which means they're not even thinking about raising rates or even remaining on hold. They're going to cut rates. Well, that's going to help the stock market. It's going to help confidence. Again, I don't want to debate the economics of that. You can do that all day. I'm just saying that the Fed is doing what it needs to do to avoid a recession. That improves Trump's odds of winning. So right now I've got Trump as a winner. There are other factors in the mix, but that's the biggest single variable.
Yeah, very good analysis on that. So you don't think there's the chances of recession with the Fed stopping their QT program? They're burning money, as you said, in the coal furnace, and them cutting rates. They're freaking out about the chances of a recession. That's why all of a sudden they went from the economy is great to we're cutting rates. I
Correct.
mean,
If they continue to raise rates and continue to reduce the money supply, the odds of a recession go way up. But they've reversed course on one, they've terminated the other. So now and by the way, it doesn't mean the economy is booming. I'm not talking about 3-4% growth. You listen to Larry Kudlow and Art Laffer and Steve Moore and Steve Forbes and all these guys. You think it was back in the Reagan administration. We're not getting that. But we're getting enough. We're getting, the first quarter GDP year over year was on an annualized basis was up 3.1%. And everyone in the White House is high-fiving. Yeah, we told you, tax cut 3.1%. Well, guess what? The best estimate for the second quarter, as of right now, is about 1.8%. Well, you average 3.1 and 1.8, you get about 2.3, and that's what we've been doing for 10 years. So it's not a boom, but it's not a recession. We just keep chugging along, but that's good enough to get Trump reelected.
and what about when he does get reelected? This is just what I think, and I'm not you, and I don't have this is my gut feeling. I think he's going to make a major move to do something with this debt. He's going to be forced to. He's going to get out in front of it, and I think in 2021 he may do something to reduce the debt or change the picture or do something. What do you think is going to happen after he gets reelected?
Well, we'll see. I've never met a real estate developer who didn't like debt. So I think you got to factor in Trump just wants to keep growing the economy. Why not? I mean, that's kind of job one for a president. But I have an entire chapter in my book, Greg, chapter 2, where I talk about debt and deficits and the entire history of U.S. debt. It's not that long, and it's sort of a deadly subject. Debt and deficits. People's eyes glaze over. They're like, "Oh, please spare me." But I think I tell the story in a sufficiently engaging way and bring it up to date and kind of bring it right up to the Trump administration. But it's funny. I was down in Washington recently for a meeting of national security experts. As you know, I do a lot on the national security side, foreign policy and intelligence, and work with the Pentagon, et cetera. And we had a relatively small group at a table, and everyone was taking their turns. And one guy, it was his turn, and he said, "Well, I just got back from Europe, and I met with foreign ministers and senior officials at NATO, and they were completely confused by Trump. They don't understand him. They never know what he's going to do next, and they're just counting the days until 2021 when he's no longer president, as if he was going to lose." And I said, well, you know what? You go back to Europe and tell your friends they're going to wake up on January 15th, 2025, and Trump's still going to be president. So they should stop the wishful thinking. Yeah, I understand Trump's mercurial and flip-flops and changes his mind. Well, get used to it. That's Trump. So figure it out, engage with the United States, do what you need to do. But this wishful thinking of you can run a countdown clock for the next 18 months and the guy's going to go away. It's just not true. But kind of getting back to the debt, there's this notion, Greg, that George Washington became president, and we didn't have any debt, but he borrowed some money, and then Jefferson borrowed money for the Louisiana Purchase, and other presidents borrowed money, and kept going up and up and up and up and up until today. Here we are, and we have $23 trillion of national debt, and that's the history of U.S. debt. That is not what happened, not even close. When George Washington became president, we already had debt. We had national debt before we were a nation. It was left over from the Revolutionary War. And of course, the Congress looked at it and said, well, we can't pay that, just default. It's the American way, just default on your debt. And it was Alexander Hamilton who said, no, let's borrow some more money, pay off the old debt, and then we can borrow more after that and pay off the new debt and keep it going. As the economy grows, we'll be able to afford the debt, we'll have good credit, and it'll be sustainable. And that was the origin of the U.S. government bond market.
Wow.
Alexander Hamilton practically invented it. But that said, the debt has not gone up continuously. It's much more of a sine wave. It goes up, and then it goes down, and then it goes up, and then it goes down throughout U.S. history. And what's the dynamic behind that? Or what's the causal factor of that, increase and decrease? It's war. Debt goes up in wartime, and it goes down in time of peace. And that's because the leaders know that you might need to borrow a lot of money if you get in a war. So we better pay off the old debt, reduce the debt, preserve the borrowing capacity, so we can fight the next war. And you see this pattern through the War of 1812 and certainly the Civil War, World War II, Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War, etc. Yeah, the debt went up in wartime, but it went down in times of peace. And this was bipartisan. That's what, when I studied this, that's what impressed me the most. And the best example is, at the end of FDR's term, he died in office, but when at the end of FDR's administration, the debt to GDP ratio, and that's the key thing. You can't just look at the debt and throw a number out there. I remind people, let's say you owe $25,000 on your credit card. Is that a problem or not? Well, you can't answer that question unless you tell me what the person's income is. If the person's making $20,000 and they've got $25,000 of debt, they're probably heading for bankruptcy. But if you're making $200,000 and you've got $25,000 of debt, you can probably pay it off with ease. And so to talk about whether debt's a problem, you have to look at the income that supports it. And in the case of the United States, it's GDP, gross domestic product. So you have to take the national debt, divide it by GDP, and that gives you a percentage. And that percentage tells you if you're in trouble or not. So at the end of World War II, that percentage was 120%, highest in American history. But what happened next was fascinating. Over the next 30 years, 35 years, both parties reduced it from 120% to 30%, which is
Wow.
very, very manageable. But that was Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower. You had Democrats and Republicans, the Fed and the Treasury, working together on this. You had Democrats, Harry Truman, John Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, Jimmy Carter. You had Republicans, Dwight Eisenhower, Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford. They worked together, and it was a bipartisan consensus that you needed to do that. And they got it down to 30% when Reagan came into office. Now, Reagan has this kind of reputation as fiscal conservative. He wasn't. He was the last of the big spenders. Reagan took the debt to GDP ratio from 30% up to 50%. But in Reagan's defense, he won the Cold War. So yeah, it's consistent with the pattern I described, where that ratio goes up in a time of war. We were in a Cold War, and Reagan won with Star Wars, 600-ship Navy, etc. So, but then along comes George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton, again a Republican and a Democrat. They did a very good job of keeping a lid on it. They did not reduce it, which in historical terms would have been what you expected. But they did keep a lid on it. They didn't make it worse. When Clinton left office, the national debt was $5 trillion, but it was, in percentage terms, it was about where it was at the end of the Reagan administration, slightly higher, but not much. But that's when the country ran off the rails. So George Bush comes in, Bush 43, he doubles it to 10 trillion. And then Obama comes in and he doubles it again from a higher base to 20 trillion. And then Trump has thrown a couple trillion on top of that. So today we're at $23 trillion. But what happened was this bipartisan consensus on reducing the debt became a bipartisan consensus on spending. Now nobody cares. They should care. We are in a very dangerous zone. By the way, the debt to GDP ratio today is 106%. That's way in the danger zone. But we didn't have, we had a war in Iraq. That was sort of a war of choice. There were no major wars in the Obama administration, and none so far in the Trump administration, and yet they have not taken advantage of the opportunity to reduce the debt, as I described earlier. So this really is a change. This is new. The pattern is broken. The debt just goes up. It doesn't, the ratio doesn't come back down again. There's no restraint at all. And I said, now this debt level is a major cause of slow growth. There's separate research from Reinhardt and Rogoff that shows that. So don't expect the U.S. economy to boom anytime soon. I don't care what they do with taxes or regulation. Those can be good things, but the debt itself is the headwind.
Could we end up in a situation where we default? Could it get so bad in this aftermath, your book here, that in the aftermath of the next crisis, which is going to be bigger than the last crisis, could we end up in a situation where there's default of government debt or massive default of corporate debt?
Well, we may be there in a couple of weeks. The debt ceiling is on the table in Congress. The debt ceiling has already been hit. The Treasury hit the debt ceiling, but they still have cash coming in from tax collections. If you get some tax collections, you got a little money to pay your bills, and they have what they call extraordinary measures. To me, it's like reaching down the back of the couch for a few quarters to pay for the pizza delivery guy. That's what the Treasury is doing right now as we speak. So we're at the debt ceiling. They can't borrow more. You can roll over existing debt. So if 10 trillion matures, you can issue, or say 100 billion matures, you can issue another 100 billion. You're not raising the total debt outstanding. So you can do rollovers and you can pick up tax collections and find, pennies and nickels in the couch. But the Treasury cannot borrow new amounts to finance the deficit. They got to fix that. The Treasury is almost out of cash. And it's what they call the X date. That's inside the Beltway term. But the X date is the day when the Treasury actually has no cash, can't pay the bills, can't pay principal and interest on the debt. What is
When's
the
the X date?
Well, no one knows. No one knows, but it's getting close. So estimates are early September. So, here we are into July. Estimates are early September, but they're estimates. They could be wrong. It could be in August. What happens if it happens in August and the Congress is in recess, which they are? You're going to have a special session in Congress. They'll fix this, Greg. I'm not trying to create hysteria here. I'm just telling you what's going on in Washington. But we're closer to default right now than people realize. You'll be hearing more about this. Having said that, there's no reason to default in the non-payment sense, assuming they raise the debt ceiling, because you can print the money. If you're Argentina and you owe dollars and you print pesos, too bad. Your pesos cannot pay off your dollar debt. But if you're the United States and you owe dollars and print dollars, you should always be able to print enough to pay off the debt. So there's no reason for an outright default. But there are two other solutions. One is inflation. Inflation is default by another name. It's like, hey, Greg, here's the $1 trillion I owe you. By the way, it's worthless. Good luck buying a loaf of bread. That is also the American way. We've always inflated our way out of the debt. We did it in the 70s, and we've done it on other occasions in U.S. history. But the problem there, show me the inflation. The Fed printed almost $4 trillion of base money between 2008 and 2014, and there was no inflation, none to speak of. So it's a sad day when the central bank wants inflation and can't get it. So inflation is a solution to a non-sustainable debt, but we can't get the inflation. The third way out is growth. I talked about the debt to GDP ratio. Well, that's got a numerator and denominator. The debt's going up. We know that. Well, what about growth? If that goes up faster than the debt, then the ratio goes down. It becomes safer. Well, guess what? That's not happening. Real growth is, I say, in the low twos on year after year for 10 years, about 2.2% per year. For nominal growth, you have to add in inflation. That's the right way to calculate it because debt is nominal. If I owe you $1, I owe you $1. It may or may not be worth more or less, but it's $1. So debt is nominal, so you have to think of the GDP in nominal terms. So take 2%, or say 2.2% real growth and 1.6% inflation, which is about what we have now. That comes to 3.8% real growth. Nominal growth. How much is the debt going up? 5, 6, 7, soon 8% per year. In other words, debt is still going up faster. Well, can't you grow your way out of it? Well, the research says no. Carmen Reinhardt and Ken Rogoff, in their books and in their papers, both joint papers individually, they've looked at this for over centuries, hundreds of cases, and what they've determined is that 90% debt to GDP is a critical threshold. Up to 90%, yeah, things are getting worse. You got a problem, but you can still muddle through and you can still get a little growth with a little bit of borrowing. But above 90%, you're through the looking glass. Now, what happens is, most people say, well, if I borrow $1 and spend it, I'll get $1 of GDP. Okay. The Keynesian theory is if I borrow $1 and spend it, I can actually get $1.50 of GDP. That's the famous Keynesian multiplier. Turns out that that only works in very special circumstances. You're in a recession, you're coming out of a recession, your debt's not too high to begin with, you have slack in the labor market, slack in industrial output. Give me all those conditions. Yeah, you borrow a little bit, you should be able to get more than $1 of growth. That's not true today. None of the things I just said are true. We're in the 10th year of an expansion. We're not in a recession. We're in the 10th year of an expansion. Our debt to GDP ratio is about the second highest in U.S. history. So we don't have slack in the labor markets, et cetera. So those conditions don't exist. But what Reinhardt and Rogoff show is when you go above 90%, you don't even get the buck. You borrow $1, spend it, and you get less than $1 of GDP. Because people don't like what they're saying. They have deflationary expectations. They save more. They say, hey, you're going to tax me to get out of this, so I better save more money today because I know the taxes are coming. So you get all these behavioral shifts. So we're way past the danger zone. There's no consensus on cutting spending. The ratio keeps going up. It's a headwind to growth. There's no way out of this. Now, you could have a severe acute debt crisis almost overnight, and I would not rule that out. But that's not the only bad outcome. The other bad outcome is Japan. Imagine 30 years of no growth punctuated by periodic recessions. That's Japan. Well, the U.S. is looking like Japan. I mean, you remember the 90s, the lost decade? In the early 2000s, everyone said, well, Japan just had a lost decade. Guess what? They've had 3 lost decades. The 90s, the 2000s, and the 2010s, 3 lost decades. The U.S. just finished its first lost decade, but I don't see anything other than a panic, which you don't want, but I don't see anything that's going to get us out of that. We may just be in for 20, 30 years of low growth. Well, you're going to go bankrupt sooner or later, but that slow growth is very disappointing, almost un-American, and that may be your best case.
What in your book with the aftermath? You say it's going to be worse the second time. You also in your notes, a few notes given to me was that the rich are ready for this, so they think.
Right.
What are they getting ready for? What is this going to look like to the little guy who's really not ready for this?
Right, and I talk about this in the book. The rich are, when I say rich, I'm talking about billionaires, hedge fund managers, elites, et cetera. They're getting ready for something that may be a lot worse than what I envision. People say, oh, Jim, you're this doom and gloom guy. And I'm not. I'm an analyst. There's lots of precedent for what I'm talking about. The New York Stock Exchange was closed for 5 months in 1914. A lot of people say, oh, that never happened. Yes, it did. The Dow Jones fell 22% in one day, October 19th, 1987. In today's terms, that would be equivalent to 5,000 Dow points, not 500, but 5,000. The NASDAQ crashed 80% in 2000, 2001 with the tech collapse. So all these things have happened. They're actually not that rare. But the rich are, they're building bunkers. They're actually entrepreneurs who have bought missile silos, abandoned missile silos in the United States government and turned them into luxury bunkers with, armed guards, steel doors. There are no windows in a silo, but you put up these high-def screens, and they have like pleasant views of canyons or rivers or whatever. So you're looking outside with a nice view of a cement silo. The other interesting thing is hedge fund billionaires. They may trade stocks and bonds and currencies all day long, but when you ask them where do they have their own money, every one of them I've spoken to has gold, physical gold. In a safe place. Don't keep it in a bank. That's not a good move, but a private vault of some kind of private. They all have gold. They don't trade it, but they have it. But you run into guys and they're like, yeah, I got a private jet. I got a farm and a silo and a security team in New Zealand. Nice, safe place. Well, okay, how are you going to get there? Well, I have a private jet at Westchester Airport. Interesting. How are you going to fuel the jet if the power goes down? Who says the pilot's going to fly? Why is he going to leave his family behind? When people who think they're ready actually don't think it all the way through. I do a lot of disaster planning for the Pentagon, and that's the first thing you learn. They say, "Well, we have an emergency plan to evacuate Washington." So you kidding me? You can't get out of Washington on a good day. The traffic is so bad. You can't get your car out of Washington very easily on a good day. You think you're going to be able to do a mass evacuation? The bridges will be jammed within minutes. The cars aren't going anywhere. If you want a solution, get a motorcycle or a bicycle. So, and that's how you get through traffic. But my point is that's how you really have to think things through. So that's why I say parenthetically, they think they are. They've got the gold, they've got the bunkers, they've got the estates in New Zealand, but they haven't thought through how a disaster actually plays out in terms of critical infrastructure, power grid, availability of fuel, et cetera. So I'm not sure they'll be much better off than anyone else.
I mean, all this could happen. We could get a credit seizure. Seems to me like we'll get another one. It just seems like we could have all kinds. They're forecasting awful. The USDA is officially forecasting higher prices, lower yields, and now there are stories breaking on Zero Hedge saying, "Hey, we're not going to get as much canned goods this year. You're not going to can as much this year because the crop outputs are down." Well, what do you
Right.
think about? I mean, this is approaching a little Mad Max scenario here, at least for a short amount of time. I mean, should people be prepared to rough it out for a few weeks or a few months?
Maybe a few years. Yeah, you should, and there are ways to do that. I mean, look, most people have been through storms of some sort or another. If you're in the Midwest, it could be a tornado. If you're in the East Coast, it could be a hurricane, California, wildfire, et cetera. Different threats in different parts of the country, and they've got batteries, they've got flashlights, they've got water, they've got maybe a warm blanket if the heat's out. They got a car. They keep the car full of gas. You put up plywood over your windows if you're expecting a hurricane. So those are all sensible things. But I've always recommended that people have a monster box right next to their flashlight. Now, just to explain, the monster box comes from the U.S. Treasury. It's nice. It was from the U.S. Mint rather, but that's controlled by the Treasury. It's in a nice Treasury green. It's got compression straps around it. But inside, you have 500 1-ounce silver eagles. These are 99.99% pure. Their quality is guaranteed. They come from the U.S. Mint. And I'm obviously an advocate for gold as a store of wealth. But if you have a 1-ounce gold coin, that's way too much. If you got to buy groceries for your family or try to get some water from a vendor in a disaster scenario, you don't want a gold coin for that. You want a silver coin, which today's market is between 15 $20. But get 500 of those right next. I mean, I lived through Hurricane Sandy, and our power was out for 3 or 4 days, and then other systems, the satellite and dish TV and all that stuff was out for about 8 days. So trees were down, cars couldn't drive, gas stations were closed, ATMs are closed. That's what you confront. And so with silver coins, you can barter easily for food and other necessities. So that's a good. So there are sensible things you can do. But just to be clear, Greg, there's a lot that could go wrong, short of what we're talking about. I'm not saying don't think about disaster scenarios. You should. But think about financial disasters that don't mean the end of the world or don't mean, every critical infrastructure system is down, but might mean that your stocks have been wiped out or down 80%, which can happen very easily. What do you do then? What about your retirement, your kids' education, your health care, your parents' health care, a new house, all the things you've been saving for when you encounter that? There are solutions to that also, and I do talk about those in the book.
Should people? It seems to me the scenario you're painting is it looks like the odds are that 2020 they're going to put this off to 2020, but after 2021 it looks like all bets are off. Was that a good assessment of what you're saying?
Well, I think it's a good question, Greg. I think you need to separate financial crises from recessions and depressions. They're two different things. They're both bad, but sometimes they go together. In 2008, they went together. We had a financial crisis starting actually in 2007. The mortgage market collapsed in 2007, And August 2007, that's when Jim Cramer had that kind of meltdown on CNBC with Aaron Burnett, who's screaming at the Fed, they know nothing, et cetera. Well, that started in 2007. It reached the acute phase in 2008, September 15, 2008, when Lehman Brothers went bankrupt. Well, that was a financial panic and a liquidity crisis. But it turned into a recession, which wasn't over until June 2009. So sometimes they go together, but not necessarily. For example, the case I mentioned, 1987, stock market fell 22% in one day, but we did not have a recession. 1998, you had the LTCM crisis. That was a full-scale liquidity crisis. The Fed actually had to have an emergency meeting. They had a scheduled meeting at the end of September, and they cut rates, but then they had a non-scheduled emergency meeting in early October, mid-October rather, and cut rates again to get us out of the financial panic. But there was no recession that year. Actually, the stock market did fairly well once the crisis passed. And then sometimes 1990, for example, you have a recession, but there's no panic. We didn't have a big financial panic in 1990, but we did have a recession. There was a real estate market collapse, but there was no contagion. It didn't spread to other markets. It was a garden variety recession without a financial panic. So they're two separate things. So let's explore them separately. Financial panics come out of nowhere. You can model it. You can give reasons why the next one will be worse, and I do. Scaling metrics, complexity theory, superlinear coefficients. I don't want to get too technical, but those are all reasons to think that a new financial panic will be worse than anything we've ever seen before.
And it won't be a recession; it'll be a depression.
Well, it could lead to that, or it could just be, if the Fed comes in and bails everybody out again. I think they'll have difficulty doing that, by the way. I think I would look for the IMF to come in, actually bail out the United States. By the way, I had this conversation with Tim Geithner privately, and I talked about that in chapter 6 of Aftermath. And I said to him, I said, well, it looks to me like the Fed is near the outer limit of what they can do with QE. They can go a little higher, but probably not much. So I said, I don't think the Fed's going to be able to bail out the system the way they did the last time. And he agreed with that. And then I said, so it looks to me that the only clean balance sheet is the IMF, where they would issue these special drawing rights, maybe $1 trillion SDRs, so-called, which is just world money, and it'd be like $1.5 trillion equivalent to their members as a source of liquidity. And he poured cold water on that. It surprised me a little bit, but he said, nah, the IMF's too clunky, they're too slow, we tried it before, it didn't work the way we thought. I disagree with that, by the way, but he was suggesting that that would not be the way to do it. So I said, well, if the Fed can't bail us out and the IMF won't, what are we going to do? And he answered the question. Again, the answer is in chapter 6. But again, whether I agree with it or not, I actually don't agree with it. But it shows you what the elites are thinking. See, Geithner was president of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, secretary of the Treasury, and he worked at the IMF. So there's no one I can think of who's kind of checked more boxes in terms of the global monetary league, with the possible exception of Bob Rubin. So when Geithner says something like that, he's not shooting from the hip. Right. He's reflecting what the elites think. I'll get a little more of this next week. I'm going up to Bretton Woods for a special meeting on the 75th anniversary of Bretton Woods. It was July 23rd, 1944.
When your book comes out.
That's the publication date of my book. So July 23rd, 2019, which is the publication date of my book, I'm going to be in Bretton Woods for this 75th anniversary meeting. It's invitation only. Larry Summers will be there. Peter Thiel is the founder of PayPal and Palantir Technologies. Ben Steele, great scholar from the Council on Foreign Relations. My friend Stephanie Kelton, she's the big brain behind modern monetary theory. Gillian Tedd of the Financial Times. It's going to be quite a crowd. And I've met a lot of them, or most of them. They're all nice people, whether I agree or disagree. In many cases, I disagree, but you respect the people. But so we'll get. This is my sort of time to check in with the global monetary elites and kind of update their thinking. But when Geithner gave me this answer, it surprised me. And again, I do put that in the book in chapter 6.
You're not going to give away the answer. The answer, how they fix it. Does that have to do with gold?
It's all in the book, and it's by the way, it's his answer, my analysis of his answer, and kind of where you go from there. So, you'll find it all in chapter 6. But I hope it's an interesting story for the reader.
Okay, all right. You're not going to give it away. Where is gold going to play in this? You wrote a book, of course, about gold. Obviously, you bring it up all the time. You're telling me that rich people have gold, gold, silver. Where does gold play a role in all this aftermath, the new aftermath?
Well, the intermediate case, or actually the short-term case, the intermediate case, is very bullish. And the reason I say that is, most people in gold, if you own gold or you bought gold mining shares or whatever, they're still traumatized by the bear market that started in 2011. Now, if you bought your gold in 1999, good for you. It was $250 an ounce, give or take. And from 1999 to 2011, you had one of the greatest bull markets ever. I mean, gold went up 700% to $1,900 per ounce. I do believe there was some serious price manipulation at that level because the Fed and basically everyone, Fed, China, everyone you can name, did not want it to go past $2,000 an ounce because that was an important psychological limit. It would have been like next stop $3,000. So they squashed it, but then it went into so that was one of the greatest bull markets in history. On top of the 70s bull market, it went from $35 an ounce in 1971 to $800 an ounce in 1980. That was a 2,000% increase, and the early 2000s bull market was a 700% increase. That's what a bull market looks like. But in 2011, you had a serious bear market. If you use 290, say 250 as a base and 1900 as a peak, that retracement to the low of 1050 in December 2015, that was a 50% retracement, slightly more than 50%. And Jim Rogers, who you all know, and is a great student of this, he said no commodity ever goes to the moon or just goes to some sky high level without a 50% retracement along the way. Well, I think that's right. He knows commodities better than I do. But we've had that. We had the 50% retracement. But a lot of people are still traumatized by that. But we're in a new bull market. And people never realize these things, Greg, until sort of after the fact. But the bottom was $1,050 an ounce on December 16th, 2015. That was the bottom. Today, it's about, give or take, $1,410 an ounce. So over that 3.5 year period, going a 4 year period since December 2015, that's a 40% increase. But it's just getting started. So, and also I thought the recent breakthrough in 1 month from the end of May to the end of June 2019, gold went from the high 1200s, like 1280, give or take, to 1440. That's a blast off. So, and we're now, it's been up and down, and gold's volatile, we all know that, but it seems to be holding the $1,400 level very well. It dipped below it a little bit, but went right back up. So 1400 seems like a new floor. We're up 40% from the 1050 low in December 2015. We're in a new bull market. And if the past bull markets are any indication, this has a very long way to go. So I'm very bullish for gold for those technical and historical reasons. And also supply demand. I mean, it's just the case that China is still buying, Russia is still buying. Both countries have more than tripled their gold reserves in the last 10 years. And they're still buying as much as they can. Mining output is flatlining. Mining output is about 4,200 tons per year, but it's been there for 5 or 6 years. So if you flatten out supply and keep increasing demand, guess what? The price goes up. That's just economics 101. There's more to it than that. You've got in many ways, the dollar price of gold is just the inverse of the dollar. If the dollar is lower, you're going to have a higher dollar price for gold, and vice versa. Well, the indications are that the Fed and the White House want the dollar to be lower because they want to, again, going back to what we talked about earlier, give the U.S. economy a little boost before the election. So that's a positive. And the third vector is geopolitics, which, look around Iran, North Korea, Syria, Ukraine, Venezuela, South China Sea. I'm not saying all these are turning into shooting wars tomorrow, but they're all hotspots that flare up and have that kind of potential. So geopolitics say gold should be higher. Supply and demand says gold should be higher. And finally, the value of the dollar and Fed policy are pointing to higher gold. And technically, we're in a bull market. So all signs are positive for higher prices in the months ahead. Intermediate term, I'm still with, and I've talked about this a lot, a $10,000 per ounce price for gold. But that's not the result of the supply and demand factors I just talked about. That would be part of a global monetary reset. That's where gold would have to be, not a choice. It's where gold would have to be if you need gold to restore confidence in the dollar. Because you don't have to have a gold standard, but if you do, you better get the price right. Because if you don't, you could be creating a massive deflationary dynamic that would throw the world into something worse than the Great Depression. So what's the right price? Well, take the money supply, take the gold supply, assume 40% backing. That's my assumption. You can be higher or lower, but this is eighth grade math. With those assumptions, you get to $10,000 per ounce pretty quickly.
Do your guys, and I'm not trying to trip you up here, but Dr. Mark Skidmore, you know who he is. He's a professor of economics at Michigan State University. He went through the Office of Inspector General reports and said, wow, the DOD and HUD is missing $21 trillion. And then they made it a national security issue with FASAB 56, and they passed it through Congress. They made it a national security issue. I mean, we got another 21 trillion on top of the 22, 23 trillion. The people in your circles watch that and go, whoa, what happened? This is a real number. This is an additional 21 trillion of missing money brought out by a college professor using Office of Inspector General reports. Do your folks in your circles look at that, and are they worried about it?
No, the debt issue, the 23 trillion of national debt, that might be the single most dangerous and disconcerting economic variable out there.
But this is an additional.
I understand you're talking about over and above that, but the missing 22 trillion or whatever, 21 trillion, whatever, it's just bad accounting. It's not like somebody took the money and put it in a safe somewhere and they're waiting to spend it, nor is it the case that it's it fell down a route. It's just bad accounting. What the professor did in the study, what the Office of Inspector General and others have done, they look at individual programs, they look at budget appropriations, they add them up, they look at what was actually spent, et cetera, and they have this difference. Well, the difference is just really bad accounting. Some of it could be black budget kind of stuff, intelligence budget or secret programs, but not that much. A few, 1 or 2 trillion. I'm not saying that's a small amount of money, but you could have a couple black programs that don't show up in the books, but that kind of number over a long period of time. It's just the Pentagon's huge. It's complex. It has its share of incompetence, just like everybody else. It's not subject to generally accepted accounting principles. There's no, you don't have a good CFO, if you will. It's just really sloppy accounting, and so it really represents.
Yeah, but they made it. I'm not trying to argue with it, but they made it a national security issue with FASB 56.
Yeah, I think bad accounting.
I mean, they said we can take our books dark. I mean, does that worry you? And especially with a book called Aftermath. I mean, you're talking about 23 trillion that we know about, and then you add another, a pretty much of a wild card that the government says is a national security issue. I mean, that's.
Well, no, they said they could take the books dark. It didn't mean they could. The numbers didn't have to add up, or they could act without appropriations. It just meant that they didn't have to tell you what they were doing with the money, because it involved national security. And I work with the CIA and the Pentagon. And there's stuff.
Does that make you worry? I mean, we're talking about a lot of money.
Here's what makes me worry. Here's what would concern me. It's not that, when some programs are genuinely, we're working on. I met with top Chinese national security officials in late 2017 when it looked like we were heading for war with North Korea, which we were. The war did not happen because Kim Jong-un changed his behavior in radical ways, and we've been talking ever since. But at the time, yes, we were on a path to war sooner than later, probably early 2018. One of the things you put in the mix, and again, I met with this Chinese top national security official who I consider a spy. I mean, you're Chinese, you have that kind of ranking, you're a spy, fine. But it doesn't mean you can't talk. But one of the things I said is that don't underestimate secret weapons. Everyone's like, oh, you can't attack North Korean missile sites because they'll shoot back and kill Korea, and that's true. That's a serious consideration. But the U.S. has a program they call it sort of the flying toaster, but it's basically a drone craft that flies over an area and disables all the electronics. It's like put your cell phone in a microwave, Greg, and turn it on. Your cell phone will catch fire. That's the end of your cell phone. Well, imagine the equivalent of a microwave that's much more powerful that could fly and disable all the electronics, command and control, communications, launch systems, you name it. Well, if that exists, and word is it may, how much do you want the North Koreans to know about that, or the Chinese for that matter? So there's a legitimate role for these black programs, and I'm certain there are new
Okay.
ones that I have no idea. But here's what would concern me: if that ability, if that flexibility were abused, if they started using it for things that are not that sensitive, not that classified, but just as a way of getting rid of accountability, yeah, that would be disturbing. There ought to be congressional hearings on that, and they should cut it out.
I wanted to get. I try to ask this question to everybody here, and that is, what does the little guy do? I mean, you're consulting for the CIA, for the Defense Department, for big time people. You're going to go on to this conference, but to the little guy watching this, he's watching this, going, "Wow, we're headed for another crisis bigger than the last. What should I do? What should the little guy do in your estimation?"
Well, it's a great question. And once, not that long ago, I was going to Las Vegas for a conference, and I get out of the airport. It was my first trip to Las Vegas. Actually, I was surprised they had slot machines in the airport. I knew they were kind of all over town, but I didn't know they were in the baggage pickup area of the airport. But there they were. Anyway, I hop in a taxi, and we're going downtown, and a ride takes a while, and the taxi driver was very nice, and he said, "What do you do?" I said, "Oh, I'm a writer and here to speak on my book and all." "What do you write about?" I was talking about financial analysis and risk and preparation and all that. And she just and I said, she said, "What should I do?" I said, "Well, I recommend 10% of your assets in investable assets in gold. So if you have $100,000, you should have $10,000 in gold." And she's very nice. She kind of snapped on me a little bit. She says, "Well, I only have $10,000 to my name. What am I supposed to do?" I said, "Buy one coin." One coin at the time was about $1,100 or whatever. I said, "Buy one coin and put it in a safe place." It's if you got $10,000, put it was slightly more than 10%, maybe $1,100, $1,200 in a gold coin. Put it in a safe place. I said, no matter what happens, if the bank freezes your account, the bank closes, other assets are go down, difficult to get to, or things are getting a little crazy, you'll have that, and that will serve you well. Or you could buy 50 silver coins. 50 silver coins would cost about the same, give or take, as one gold coin. Maybe 50 silver coins is a better way to do it. But even people of very modest means, with very low savings, who don't have a lot of disposable income, can afford to buy a little bit of gold or silver. And like I say, I'd rather have a stack of 20 silver coins, which is about $1,000, or sorry, 50 silver coins, let's say, which is about $1,000, than a bunch of credit cards, because in a dire situation, your credit cards won't work.
And you're liking silver. You're liking tangible assets. And is the theme buy real stuff? That'd be gold, silver, your car title, your house, canned goods. I mean, is the theme buy real stuff for little guys?
Sure. And again, I don't, whether you're very wealthy or a person of very modest means, you can still do that. Let's define the real stuff category. So, yeah, gold and silver, but fine art's a little more of a high-end type investment, but land, natural resources, water, energy, if you want to invest in funds or want to invest in those particular stocks. But for the everyday person, so yeah, a little bit of gold, a little bit of silver, keep some cash in the bank, and land and your property, and those are real assets. They're going to serve you well. If you're highly leveraged and you put all the money in the stock market, and the stock market gets wiped out, and your bank comes to collect the debt, you're going to lose your house. that's not a good situation to be in.
So should you shun debt in what's coming? Shun debt?
Yes. Now, look, I know a lot of real estate investors, and I know how they operate. And some say, they want infinite leverage, so they like to buy no money down and 100% debt, and then they collect rents, and it goes up, and then they can sell it and pay off the debt and keep the money. Those strategies work. They do work in a even a mildly inflationary environment, but they are disastrous in a deflationary environment because then the asset goes down and the real value of the debt goes up, and you're underwater and heading for bankruptcy before you know it. So you're always making a bet. Nothing's risk free, and real diversification is always the way to go. But when I say real diversification, let me explain what I mean. I run into people and they say, "Well, I'm diversified. I got 50 stocks. I'm so highly diversified." I say, "No, you're not. You have one asset class. You may have 50 stocks, but they're all stocks, and stocks are more and more commoditized. They tend to go up together, down together, risk off, risk on, et cetera. And so, not all the time, and there's obviously idiosyncratic performance, but 50 stocks to me is not a diversified portfolio. It's one asset class that could get wiped out all at once. Real diversification would be things where there's no correlation. So what's the correlation between gold and stocks? Pretty low. It's almost zero. Treasury notes and other kinds of commodities, silver, let's say, not much correlation. So some portfolio, have some stocks if you like, have some bonds. I recommend cash. People underestimate the value of cash. They go, "Oh, it doesn't have much yield." Well, it's not supposed to. It's cash. But cash gives you a couple other things. Number one, it reduces the volatility of the overall portfolio. So if you have gold and it's volatile, and you have stocks and they're volatile, well, if you have cash in between in your portfolio, that reduces the overall volatility of the portfolio. You can sleep a little better. But equally important, cash has huge embedded optionality, meaning that when everything else is collapsing and people are selling everything, saying, "Give me my money back," and markets are going down, you can step back, take a deep breath, and you're the person who can go shopping for bargains because you don't have to sell anything because you have cash. So it serves a very valuable role in that respect. So to me, a diversified portfolio would look like gold, silver, cash, real estate, and sure, some stocks and bonds. There's certainly room for that, but don't go all in any of those asset classes, including gold. Because that's imprudent to be that heavily concentrated in anything. I don't care what it is.
And owning your house, your car, shunning debt, you would going into what we're going into, you wouldn't be risking a lot of debt.
No, look, if you're a real estate developer and you're a speculator and you've got you've got it on a corporation. The corporation can file for bankruptcy and it doesn't affect you personally. Yeah, that's how they do it. But if you're again a person of modest means and you own your house, I would not be chasing home equity loans. I would not be leveraging up my house. Deflation cannot be ruled out. Everyone's worried about inflation. Okay, I think about that a lot, but deflation is equally possible. Let's not rule out deflation. And there's nothing worse in deflation than debt, because the real value of the debt actually goes up.
Jim Rickards, I've kept you a long time. You've been very gracious and answered all my questions. Some planned, some not so planned. You did a great job. The book coming out next Tuesday. It's in the pre-order market, also in all the bookstores. This is going to be this might be your fifth bestseller. Is that right?
Well, we'll see. I'm hoping for that. I certainly appreciate this. Anyone buying the book, I certainly appreciate the support. But I hope you enjoy it also.
Who writes four bestsellers in a row and maybe number five, which this may be, which probably it will be. It's you get your money's worth, folks. I mean, it's a lot here. And the answer to the Geithner question is what they do is in chapter 6, folks. So that's a nice one. James G. Rickards, thank you for joining us today on USA Watchdog. For you guys on YouTube, I will put the links to the pre-order, to the book, all to your website. It's the James Rickards Project, correct? Your website?
That's the website. Yep.
And I'll put your website up there because I know you put some free stuff on there for people too as well. James Rickards, best-selling author. Thank you so much for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Greg.